Slowly allow the present moment to loosen its hold on you. The day, with all its weight and urgency, can remain where it belongs, somewhere far behind your breathing. There is nothing you need to solve tonight, nothing you need to remember perfectly. Only the gentle act of listening, as awareness drifts toward something older and quieter than thought. Imagine time not as a straight road, but as deep water. Layers resting upon layers, each one holding echoes of what came before. Beneath the noise of modern life, beneath language and names, there is a calm depth where ancient memory still waits, undisturbed. Tonight, we descend toward that depth, slowly, without resistance. Long before humanity learned to measure history, before words were pressed into clay or stone, the world was already shaped by events too vast to be fully remembered. What survived of those events did not endure as clear stories, but as impressions, patterns, and silences. This is where our journey begins. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the edges of your thoughts soften. What follows is not meant to awaken or alarm, but to carry you gently into rest, guided by the quiet remnants of a forgotten war among the Anunnaki. Before humanity understood itself as human, before the first cities rose between the rivers of Mesopotamia, the ancient Sumerians believed the world was already shaped by will and consequence. Existence, in their understanding, was not accidental. It had been organized, measured, and divided by beings who existed before memory could name them. These beings were called the Anunnaki, not merely gods, but authorities woven into the architecture of reality itself. They were associated with heaven and earth, with decree and destiny, with forces that moved long before human awareness emerged. If these long, quiet journeys into ancient time bring you a sense of calm or belonging, you may choose to subscribe, not as a request, but as a gentle way of returning here again, whenever you wish, to this space where forgotten histories unfold slowly and wait for you. The earliest Sumerian tablets do not introduce the Anunnaki through spectacle or creation alone. They appear through function, through order, through responsibility. Each Anunnaki held a domain, a role within a larger system that governed the movement of the sky, the fertility of the land, and the invisible laws that connected all things. At first, this system was described as stable, balanced. The heavens moved as they should. The earth responded. Time flowed in harmony. There was no urgency to explain origins, because order itself was evidence enough. Yet beneath this surface of balance, the texts hint at something quieter, something gradual. Not chaos, but strain. The Sumerians did not write of perfection lost in a single moment. They wrote of imbalance accumulating over long spans of time. Certain beings ruled, others labored. The lower divine entities, often called the Igigi, were tasked with the continuous work of shaping and maintaining the physical world. They raised land from water, carved channels through earth, and sustained the rhythms that made life possible. Their labor was constant. Their rest was limited. Their voices were distant from authority. This uneven distribution of burden was not immediately questioned. In the ancient worldview, duty was sacred. Order was preserved through obedience. But even among immortals, endurance has limits. The tablets speak carefully here, using symbolic language rather than accusation. They describe weariness, murmuring, a growing heaviness within the divine order. These words matter because they signal the beginning of fracture, not through violence, but through exhaustion. What followed was not recorded as thunder or fire. There is no vivid account of gods striking one another down. Instead, there is a moment of refusal. The Igigi cease their labor. They gather together in the darkness and surround the dwelling of Enlil, one of the highest authorities among the Anunnaki. They do not come armed for war. They carry the tools of their work. This detail is deliberate and deeply revealing. It frames the moment not as ambition but as protest. not conquest, but resistance. In this quiet confrontation, the first outline of a civil war among the Anunnaki emerges. A war not fought with weapons, but with withdrawal. A challenge not to power itself, but to the structure that distributed it. The ruling Anunnaki are unsettled, not because they fear defeat, but because the system they believed eternal has revealed its fragility. Authority, once questioned, can no longer be assumed. Councils are convened. Deliberation replaces command. Punishment is considered, then restrained. The texts emphasize hesitation, silence, careful choice. This is important. It suggests that even the Anunnaki understood the danger of escalation. A direct war among the architects of reality would risk unraveling the very order they governed. The conflict had to be resolved without destruction. The solution that emerges is not reconciliation, but redirection. A new being is proposed, one shaped from clay and divine essence, one designed to inherit the labor that had sparked rebellion. Humanity, in the Sumerian tradition, is born not from curiosity or love alone, but from the need to stabilize a fractured divine order. Creation, in this sense, is consequence. This origin changes everything. Humanity enters a world already shaped by compromise. The peace that follows is functional, not healed. Unity returns in appearance, but memory of division lingers beneath the surface. The Anunnaki continue to rule, but more cautiously. Distance begins to grow between gods and creation. Boundaries harden. Silence becomes a tool of preservation. The Sumerians did not frame this as tragedy. They did not condemn the gods. They observed pattern. They understood that even beings of immense power were bound by balance, and that imbalance, once introduced, never fully disappears. It transforms, it hides, it passes forward. And so, from its very beginning, humanity inherits more than labor. It inherits tension, a world shaped by a war that could not be spoken openly, only remembered indirectly, a world where order exists, but must be maintained carefully, because even the gods once failed to hold it without fracture. As you rest with this thought, notice how the story does not rush. It does not demand belief or certainty. It offers atmosphere, a sense that beneath the surface of civilization lies a much older memory, moving slowly, patiently, waiting for awareness to grow quiet enough to feel it. The decision to create humanity did not erase the consequences of the divine fracture. It merely redirected them. The Sumerian texts suggest that once humans assumed the burden of labor, the immediate tension among the Anunnaki eased, but the deeper division remained, unspoken and unresolved. Unity returned in form, not in essence. The gods continued to function as an assembly, yet something within their order had permanently shifted. Authority was no longer unquestioned, balance was no longer assumed. From this moment onward, distance became a strategy. The Anunnaki did not vanish, but they withdrew from closeness. Direct interaction with humanity grew rare, filtered through intermediaries, rituals, and signs rather than presence. The world was allowed to run, but under watchful silence. The gods had learned that proximity carried risk. Too much involvement blurred boundaries. Too little invited disorder. What followed was careful restraint. Within this quieter age, distinct orientations among the Anunnaki began to surface more clearly. Enlil, associated with command, structure, and separation, embodied the instinct to preserve order through limitation. Humanity, in his view, required boundaries. Noise, growth, and autonomy were potential threats to stability. Enki, by contrast, moved through the margins. Linked to water, depth, and hidden knowledge, he represented adaptation rather than control. Where Enlil imposed distance, Enki offered guidance. Where Enlil restricted, Enki preserved. The tablets do not describe this divergence as open conflict. There is no second rebellion, no declared war. Instead, the disagreement unfolds subtly, through action rather than confrontation. Knowledge is given quietly. Lifelines are extended discreetly. When correction comes, it does not always arrive evenly. Floods, plagues, and reductions in lifespan appear not as moral judgments, but as recalibrations. The world is adjusted, not punished. Humanity exists within this tension, often unaware of its origin. Created as a solution, humans also become participants. Their growth tests the system. Their unpredictability echoes the very instability that once troubled the gods themselves. And so, the ancient conflict continues, not as battle, but as influence, not in the heavens alone, but within the unfolding rhythm of civilization. The Sumerians sensed this inheritance. They did not see their world as freshly made, but as carefully managed. Order was real, but fragile. Stability was earned through repetition, ritual, and respect for limits. Beneath every law and prayer lay an unspoken awareness. Even the gods had struggled to maintain balance, and because of that, the world must always be held gently, lest the old fracture stir again beneath the surface of time. Over time, the presence of the Anunnaki shifted from immediacy to atmosphere. They were no longer experienced as beings who intervened directly, but as forces embedded within the structure of reality itself. The sky, the rivers, the seasons, and the slow turning of years became their language. For the Sumerians, this was not a loss of faith, but a deepening of it. The gods had not disappeared. They had become subtle. This subtlety reshaped how time was understood. History was not a straight line moving away from creation, but a cycle returning again and again to familiar conditions. Prosperity carried the seed of excess. Excess invited correction. Correction cleared the way for renewal. These patterns were not blamed on chance. They were read as echoes of a much older imbalance, one that predated humanity itself. The memory of the Anunnaki conflict survived here, encoded within expectation. When cities grew too loud, too numerous, too confident, people sensed danger long before collapse arrived. Unease crept into dreams. Rituals multiplied. Omens were taken seriously. These were not superstitions, but inherited sensitivities. Humanity had learned, even without remembering why, that stability was temporary and required care. In this way, civilization became an extension of divine experience. What the Anunnaki had encountered among themselves, humanity now encountered within society. Authority demanded restraint. Labor demanded fairness. Knowledge demanded humility. The war among the gods had ended without resolution, and its lessons continued to unfold quietly through human time, shaping the rise and fall of worlds that believed themselves permanent. As centuries passed and cities multiplied along the rivers, the Sumerians became increasingly aware that their world was governed less by sudden divine action and more by slow, almost imperceptible adjustment. The Anunnaki no longer needed to appear because their influence had settled into structure. Law, agriculture, kingship, and ritual all carried the weight of decisions made long before the first human generation could remember. The gods were present in consequence rather than command. This understanding shaped a particular kind of caution. Growth was celebrated, but never without anxiety. Large cities required constant appeasement of unseen forces. Kings ruled, but their authority was fragile, renewed repeatedly through offerings and ceremony. Power was tolerated only so long as it maintained balance. Excess, whether in wealth, population, or ambition, was viewed as dangerous, not sinful, but destabilizing. The memory of divine imbalance had taught the world that unchecked expansion invites correction. The Anunnaki conflict lived on through this awareness. Though no longer spoken of directly, it survived as a fear of repeating something ancient and catastrophic. Humanity did not know the details, but it felt the pattern. Too much noise once disturbed the gods. Too much strain once fractured heaven itself. and so silence, restraint, and repetition became sacred tools. Ritual was not symbolic alone, it was preventative, a way of keeping reality from tipping too far in either direction. Even catastrophe, when it came, was not interpreted as abandonment. Floods, droughts, and collapse were framed as necessary rebalancing. The world was not being destroyed, it was being corrected. This perspective softened despair and reduced rebellion. Survival mattered more than explanation. Continuity mattered more than blame. In this way, humanity inherited not only labor, but responsibility. The gods had learned through their own division that force was dangerous and proximity destabilizing. Humans would now learn through repetition that balance requires humility. Civilization became a long experiment in restraint, conducted beneath the quiet shadow of a war that had never been fully remembered, yet never truly forgotten. As memory stretched thinner across generations, the Anunnaki gradually transformed from figures of origin into forces of orientation. People no longer looked to the gods to explain specific events, but to understand direction. The question was no longer why something happened, but whether it fit within the larger rhythm of the world. This shift marked a profound evolution in human consciousness. Meaning was no longer anchored solely in divine will, but in alignment with pattern. The Sumerians believed that when alignment was lost, the world itself signaled discomfort. Crops failed without obvious cause. Rains arrived too early or too late. Social order weakened. These signs were not interpreted as punishment, but as imbalance rising toward the surface. The Anunnaki, though distant, were understood to remain attentive, not intervening quickly, but allowing strain to reveal itself fully before correction came. Patience, once learned through conflict, had become divine policy. Kingship developed under this shadow of caution. A ruler was not divine by nature, but conditional by function. Authority existed only to the extent that it preserved balance between human activity and cosmic order. When a king ruled too harshly or expanded too aggressively, unrest followed. When restraint was lost, collapse soon arrived. These outcomes reinforced an unspoken lesson. Power, even when justified, carries the seed of its own undoing. The hidden war among the Anunnaki echoed here most clearly. The gods had fractured when roles hardened and voices went unheard. Human societies now mirrored this risk constantly. Laborers strained beneath authority. Elites drifted away from consequence. Each imbalance repeated the ancient pattern in smaller form. Civilization became a reflection of divine experience, scaled down but no less real. What prevented total collapse was repetition. Ritual, law, and tradition slowed change enough for correction to occur before destruction became absolute. These practices were not conservative by accident. They were stabilizing by design. Humanity had inherited a world already tested by excess. Innovation was allowed, but cautiously. Memory, even fragmented, acted as restraint. In this long continuity, the Anunnaki no longer needed to speak. Their war had already taught the world how fragile order could be. Silence became sufficient. The gods had learned that correction worked best when it appeared natural, and humanity, living within this quiet system, slowly learned the same truth. As generations accumulated, humanity's awareness of the divine shifted even further inward. The Anunnaki were no longer perceived as external overseers, watching from a fixed point beyond the sky, but as presences diffused through reality itself. Their influence was felt in timing rather than command, in consequence rather than instruction. The world responded not to prayer alone, but to proportion. When actions exceeded their proper scale, response followed. When restraint was practiced, continuity endured. This understanding changed how catastrophe was anticipated. Disaster was rarely seen as sudden or arbitrary. It was expected to arrive gradually, announced by imbalance long before it became visible. Social unrest, environmental irregularity, and the erosion of trust were read as early signs. The Sumerians believed that the world always warned before it corrected. This belief reduced fear and replaced it with attentiveness. One did not wait for the gods to strike. One listened for the subtle signals that balance was slipping. The Anunnaki conflict survived most clearly in this attentiveness. The gods themselves had once failed to recognize strain until it became unavoidable. Humanity, inheriting that lesson indirectly, learned to observe more carefully. Priests did not merely interpret omens. They monitored rhythm. Farmers watched seasons. Kings watched public order. Every role became part of a distributed awareness, compensating for the absence of direct divine governance. Yet distance did not mean abandonment. The gods were believed to remain present at the threshold of intervention, acting only when imbalance threatened to become irreversible. This restraint reflected wisdom gained through experience. Force had once risked collapse. Silence had proven safer. The Anunnaki, having learned the cost of internal fracture, now governed through patience. In this quiet arrangement, humanity matured, not into certainty, but into responsibility. The world no longer revolved around divine decree alone. It required participation. Balance became a shared task between unseen forces and visible action. The ancient war, now far removed from memory, continued to shape behavior without ever being named. And so civilization moved forward, guided not by revelation, but by rhythm. What endured was not the story of the gods, but the structure their conflict had etched into time itself. Over long spans of time, this shared responsibility reshaped how humanity understood itself within the cosmos. People no longer saw themselves as temporary occupants of a world owned by distant gods. They saw themselves as caretakers of a system that could endure only through attention and restraint. The Anunnaki had shaped the foundations, but humanity now lived within the consequences of that design. Every action, however small, participated in maintaining or disturbing the balance that held reality together. This awareness produced a particular kind of humility. The Sumerians did not imagine progress as endless ascent. Advancement was welcomed, but always watched closely. Expansion carried risk. Innovation demanded caution. Even knowledge itself was treated with care, because to know too much too quickly was to approach the boundary that once unsettled the gods. Memory of that boundary survived as instinct, not instruction. People felt when they were moving too far, even if they could not explain why. The Anunnaki conflict, buried beneath ritual and rhythm, continued to express itself through social tension. When labor became too heavy, unrest followed. When authority hardened into dominance, resistance emerged. These patterns were not interpreted as failures of character, but as signals that balance was again being tested. Humanity was repeating, on a smaller scale, the same pressures that had once divided the divine order. The world did not punish this repetition. It responded to it. Correction came in many forms. Sometimes it arrived as political collapse, sometimes as environmental disruption, sometimes as cultural forgetting. Each correction reduced complexity, slowed momentum, and returned societies to simpler forms. These moments were painful, but they were not seen as meaningless. They were understood as necessary contractions within a living system. The gods no longer needed to intervene directly. The pattern enforced itself. Through this long process, humanity learned that stability was not a state to be achieved once, but a condition that required constant renewal. Peace was temporary. Order was provisional. Continuity depended on listening rather than control. This lesson, learned first by the Anunnaki through their own division, had now become the quiet inheritance of the world. As the night deepens and thought slows, this rhythm becomes easier to sense. Expansion and contraction, memory and forgetting, effort and rest. The ancient war fades further into background, no longer a story to be followed, but a pulse moving beneath awareness. And within that pulse, the world continues, steady and unfinished, carrying forward a balance learned long ago through fracture rather than force. As humanity continued to live within these inherited rhythms, the sense of divine absence slowly transformed into something quieter and more intimate. The gods were no longer expected to appear in moments of crisis. Their silence itself became meaningful. It suggested trust. The Anunnaki, having once struggled to maintain order among themselves, now allowed the world to move without constant correction. This restraint was not weakness, it was learned wisdom. Within this silence, memory adapted. What could no longer be recalled as story survived as atmosphere. A feeling that the world had limits, a sense that growth required pause, a subtle awareness that every system, no matter how stable, carried within it the possibility of fracture. These impressions shaped behavior more effectively than command ever could. People learned to slow themselves, to repeat what worked, to hesitate before excess. The Anunnaki war lived on most clearly in this hesitation. The gods had once moved too confidently within their own authority, believing order could sustain itself indefinitely. Humanity inherited the opposite instinct. It questioned permanence. It distrusted absolutes. Even success was treated cautiously, as something that required balance rather than celebration. Prosperity was temporary. Stability was borrowed. This worldview influenced how people related to time itself. The future was not imagined as endless progress, but as return. What had happened before could happen again. This did not inspire fear. It encouraged preparedness. Cycles became reassuring. If collapse followed growth, then renewal would follow collapse. Nothing was final. Nothing was wasted. Even loss served continuity. And so the ancient conflict completed another transformation. From divine struggle to social pattern to inner awareness. The Anunnaki no longer needed to be remembered by name. Their experience had become embedded within perception itself. As the mind grows quieter, this embedded memory feels less like knowledge and more like calm understanding. The world is not broken, it is unfinished. And it continues, slowly, carefully, shaped by lessons learned long before humanity learned how to listen. As this understanding deepened, humanity began to sense that history itself was a kind of breathing. Long periods of expansion were followed by moments of contraction, just as the body inhales and exhales without conscious effort. Civilizations did not fail because they were flawed, but because they had reached the outer edge of balance. This interpretation softened despair and reduced the desire to resist what could not be held indefinitely. The Anunnaki conflict, once rooted in divine hierarchy and labor, now expressed itself through scale. When societies grew too complex, too rigid, or too centralized, tension accumulated quietly beneath the surface. Laws multiplied, authority concentrated. Distance grew between those who ruled and those who sustained the world through work. These conditions felt familiar, even when their origin was forgotten. They were echoes of an ancient pattern repeating itself through human form. Myth gradually adapted to carry this recognition without reopening fear. Stories no longer spoke directly of gods rebelling against gods. Instead, they described floods, fires, and ages ending. These images allowed memory to survive without destabilizing belief. They reassured listeners that collapse was not the end of meaning, but a passage within a larger cycle that had always existed. In this way, catastrophe became less frightening and more instructive. It reminded humanity of proportion. It returned societies to simpler arrangements where balance could be restored. The Anunnaki, having withdrawn into silence, no longer needed to intervene. Their war had already taught the world how to correct itself. As thought slows and the body rests, this rhythm feels natural. Expansion and release, tension and easing. Nothing is forced, nothing is permanent. The ancient conflict fades further into the background, no longer a story to be remembered, but a quiet principle shaping time itself, carrying the world forward without urgency or end. As ages turned and memories softened, the sense of inherited balance began to express itself through observation of the sky. The heavens, unlike cities or kingdoms, did not collapse. Stars returned to their places. Seasons followed familiar paths. For ancient peoples, this constancy offered reassurance that order still existed, even when life on Earth felt unstable. The Anunnaki, once imagined as rulers of both sky and land, became associated more closely with these enduring motions. Their authority was no longer heard in commands, but seen in repetition. Time itself took on sacred weight. Days, years, and long celestial cycles were not simply measurements, but signals. When alignments shifted, when rhythms changed, humanity paid attention. These moments were not feared as omens of punishment, but respected as indicators that adjustment was approaching. The sky did not threaten, it informed. In this way, the ancient conflict among the gods was translated into a cosmic language that could be observed without being relived. This shift protected both humanity and memory. By placing meaning in cycles rather than personalities, the world avoided reopening the wound of divine fracture. The Anunnaki no longer needed to be imagined as beings capable of disagreement. Their experience had become abstracted into law-like motion. Stability was no longer dependent on divine unity, but on alignment with pattern. The war, once dangerous to remember, became safe to contemplate through stars and seasons. As you rest with this thought, notice how the night sky still carries this same calm authority. It does not hurry. It does not argue. It simply returns, again and again, to familiar positions. In that return lies a quiet assurance. Whatever rises will settle. Whatever strains will ease. The ancient world learned this slowly, through loss and repetition. And even now, long after the Anunnaki faded into silence, the rhythm they left behind continues to guide the world gently forward, one cycle at a time. As attention turned increasingly toward the sky, the ancient world began to read meaning not in sudden events, but in duration. What lasted mattered more than what erupted. The Anunnaki, once imagined as immediate presences, were now understood through what endured beyond destruction. Stars outlived cities. Seasons returned after famine. The sky remembered what the earth was forced to forget. In this endurance, humanity sensed a deeper form of authority, one that did not need to assert itself loudly to remain absolute. This shift changed how catastrophe was remembered. Floods were no longer isolated disasters, but recurring gestures within a much longer rhythm. Each inundation erased detail, but preserved structure. After the waters withdrew, the land returned, altered, but familiar. Life resumed, simpler, quieter, closer to its foundations. These moments were understood not as failures of creation, but as moments when excess had been gently but firmly removed. The Anunnaki, though silent, were believed to remain present in this restraint. What survived these resets was not wealth or power, but pattern. Agriculture returned, kinship reformed, ritual resumed. Humanity rebuilt not because it expected perfection, but because continuity was possible. The ancient conflict among the gods had taught the world that nothing holds forever, yet nothing is lost completely. Memory thinned, but rhythm remained. This thinning was protective. Too much memory risked repetition of the original fracture. Too little risked chaos. Balance lived between forgetting and recall. Within society, this understanding produced caution toward permanence. Even monuments were built with an awareness of eventual ruin. Stone was chosen not because it would last forever, but because it would last long enough to anchor memory without resisting time. Kings ruled knowing their reigns were temporary. Laws were enforced knowing they would one day be revised or replaced. This humility did not weaken civilization, it stabilized it. The Anunnaki conflict lived quietly inside this humility. The gods had once believed structure alone could preserve harmony. They learned, through division, that flexibility mattered more. Humanity inherited this lesson not as doctrine, but as instinct. When systems grew rigid, pressure followed. When adaptation was allowed, continuity endured. The war among the gods no longer needed to be told. It was being lived out gently, repeatedly, across generations. As rest deepens, this long perspective begins to feel calming rather than heavy. You are not standing at the center of history. You are resting within a cycle that has carried countless lives before you and will carry countless more after. The ancient world understood this well. The Anunnaki stepped back so that time itself could teach. And time, patient and quiet, continues that work even now. With this long patience learned, humanity began to trust time more than intervention. The need for constant divine correction faded, replaced by confidence in gradual adjustment. The Anunnaki, once associated with command and decree, were now linked to endurance itself. Their influence was felt in what survived repeated collapse, rather than in what dominated briefly. Stability became a measure of alignment, not authority. This trust reshaped how people related to loss. When cities fell or traditions faded, grief was real but not absolute. What mattered was not preserving every form, but preserving the conditions that allowed renewal. Seeds were saved, stories were softened, skills were passed quietly from one generation to the next. Civilization learned to travel light through time, carrying only what could endure correction. The ancient conflict among the gods continued to echo here. The Anunnaki had once struggled because roles became fixed and voices unheard. Humanity responded by valuing adaptability. Social structures remained layered, but flexibility was prized. When pressure mounted, systems bent rather than shattered. This did not prevent collapse entirely, but it reduced its violence. Correction arrived as contraction rather than annihilation. In this way, catastrophe became a teacher rather than an enemy. Each reset refined awareness, encouraging restraint and attentiveness. Humanity did not need to know the story of the divine war to learn from it. The lesson had already shaped the world. Balance could not be enforced through power alone. It required listening. As the mind drifts toward stillness, this lesson feels less intellectual and more embodied. Breath slows, thought eases. Awareness contracts gently, preparing for rest. The ancient world trusted this rhythm completely, just as sleep follows wakefulness without instruction. Renewal follows collapse without force. The Anunnaki, having once disturbed balance through certainty, left behind a quieter wisdom, and that wisdom continues to move through time, steady and unhurried, carrying the world forward into the night. As awareness of these cycles settled more deeply into human thought, attention shifted from prevention to preparation. The ancient world accepted that correction would come, not as an interruption, but as part of continuity itself. Rather than asking how to avoid collapse entirely, people asked how to endure it without losing what mattered most. Survival became less about resistance and more about preservation of rhythm. This perspective reshaped memory. Instead of clinging to exact histories, cultures preserved gestures, ways of planting, ways of building, ways of gathering and separating. These gestures survived even when names and origins dissolved. They were reliable because they were simple, and simplicity proved resilient across time. The Anunnaki conflict, once complex and dangerous, now expressed itself through this preference for what could bend without breaking. Human consciousness adapted accordingly. Certainty softened. Absolute claims lost their appeal. The world was no longer expected to behave perfectly, only predictably enough to navigate. This shift reduced fear. If collapse was inevitable, then it could be met calmly. If renewal always followed, then loss did not need to feel final. The ancient mind rested within this understanding, neither hopeful nor despairing, but attentive. The gods, now distant, were believed to observe this maturation quietly. Their earlier conflict had taught them that control invited fracture. Humanity's gradual acceptance of limits suggested that the lesson had taken root. The world no longer required loud correction. Balance emerged through shared restraint rather than decree. As sleep approaches, this acceptance mirrors the body's own process. Muscles release, thoughts thin. Control gives way to rhythm. Nothing is forced. Nothing resists. The same intelligence that carries breath into rest once carried civilizations through collapse and return. The Anunnaki have long since faded into silence, but the balance they struggled to learn continues to move gently, guiding both world and mind toward renewal. As humanity settled more fully into this long relationship with time, patience became one of its quiet strengths. The ancient world did not expect quick resolution, either from gods or from history itself. Problems were understood to unfold slowly, and so were their answers. This patience was not passive, it was observant. People learned to watch for subtle changes in rhythm rather than dramatic breaks. A shift in the behavior of rivers, a gradual change in climate, a slow hardening of social roles. These were read as early signs that balance was again being tested. In this attentive waiting, the legacy of the Anunnaki conflict continued to work beneath awareness. The gods had once waited too long to address strain within their own order, allowing imbalance to deepen until refusal became the only language left. Humanity, inheriting that lesson without its story, learned to notice pressure earlier. When labor grew too heavy, rituals multiplied. When authority drifted too far from consequence, stories of past collapses resurfaced. Memory returned not as record, but as caution. This is where myth took on its most important role. Myths were not explanations of the past, but stabilizers of the present. They reminded listeners that no order was permanent and no collapse was meaningless. By telling stories of floods, lost ages, and distant gods, societies gave form to anxiety without allowing it to dominate. The Anunnaki no longer needed to appear within these myths directly. Their experience had been distilled into warning and reassurance at the same time. Through this process, humanity developed a relationship with uncertainty that was neither fearful nor dismissive. The unknown was expected. Silence was trusted. Not every question required an answer because not every imbalance required immediate correction. Time itself was allowed to work. This trust marked a significant departure from the age of direct divine rule. The gods had stepped back so that patience could step forward. As you rest with these ideas, notice how similar this feels to the approach of sleep. The mind does not force rest, it allows it. Awareness gradually releases its grip, trusting that the body knows what to do next. The ancient world lived within that same trust. The Anunnaki conflict, once a crisis of authority and labor, had resolved into a lesson of timing. And timing, once learned, does not need to be remembered explicitly. It lives quietly in the way one waits, watches, and eventually lets go. As patience became embedded within culture, humanity's relationship with the past softened even further. The ancient world did not seek to recover every detail of what had been lost. Instead, it learned to live with absence. Gaps in memory were not treated as failures, but as natural spaces where imagination, ritual, and silence could coexist. What mattered was not complete understanding, but continuity of rhythm. The Anunnaki conflict, already distant, now existed primarily as a quiet intuition that too much certainty was dangerous. This intuition shaped how knowledge itself was handled. Wisdom was not accumulated endlessly, but distributed carefully. Certain teachings were repeated openly, while others were reserved, passed slowly, or intentionally obscured. This was not secrecy for power's sake, but protection. The gods had once possessed immense knowledge and authority, yet still fractured under strain. Humanity learned that restraint in knowing could be as important as restraint in ruling. The result was a culture that valued repetition over novelty. What worked was preserved. What disrupted balance was approached cautiously. Innovation was not rejected, but slowed, tested against time rather than enthusiasm. This approach reduced extremes. Change occurred, but gradually, allowing the world to adjust without tearing itself apart. The Anunnaki, had they observed this, would have recognized the lesson they themselves learned too late. Within daily life, this translated into rhythms that mirrored the larger cycle. Work was followed by rest. Festivals punctuated labor. Silence balanced speech. These patterns were not arbitrary. They were stabilizing forces, ensuring that no single aspect of existence dominated for too long. Excess, once identified as the root of divine fracture, was carefully avoided. The memory of catastrophe reinforced this discipline. Floods and collapses were remembered not in detail but in feeling. A deep respect for forces larger than human ambition settled into consciousness. People understood that when systems grew too rigid or too loud, correction would come, whether invited or not. This understanding did not paralyze action, it guided it. In this way, humanity slowly became less reactive and more responsive. Instead of waiting for divine intervention, societies learned to adjust themselves. Instead of demanding permanence, they planned for transition. The Anunnaki had withdrawn so that this maturation could occur. Their silence was not abandonment, but allowance. As the mind grows quieter, this long patience feels familiar. Thoughts arise and fade. No effort is required to hold them. Balance returns on its own when force is released. The ancient world trusted this process deeply. The Anunnaki conflict, once a rupture in divine order, had transformed into a lesson written into behavior itself, and behavior, repeated gently over time, proved more enduring than memory or command ever could. As humanity grew accustomed to living within these gentle constraints, a deeper sense of proportion began to guide decision and belief. People no longer measured success solely by expansion or accumulation, but by how long stability could be sustained without strain. A city that endured quietly for generations was valued more than one that rose quickly and loudly. This preference reflected an ancient intuition. Sudden growth had once unsettled even the gods. Slowness, by contrast, allowed balance to adjust. This perspective reshaped how power was understood. Authority was tolerated only when it remained responsive. Leaders were expected to listen as much as they commanded, to observe signs of imbalance before they hardened into crisis. When rulers ignored these signs, unrest followed naturally, without the need for mythic explanation. The Anunnaki no longer needed to intervene because consequence itself had become the teacher. Religion adapted to this maturity. Worship shifted away from petition and toward alignment. Offerings were made not to change fate, but to remain within rhythm. Prayers asked less for favor and more for clarity. The gods were addressed as witnesses rather than enforcers, their silence interpreted as space rather than neglect. This quiet spirituality reflected the wisdom earned through divine fracture. Within this framework, catastrophe lost much of its terror. When collapse arrived, it was met with sorrow but not shock. Communities reorganized, simplified, and endured. Knowledge contracted, but essentials survived. This contraction was not viewed as regression, but as correction. Complexity had grown too heavy. Reduction restored movement. The Anunnaki conflict, now almost entirely dissolved into pattern, continued to influence this acceptance. The gods had once attempted to sustain a complex order without sufficient adjustment. Humanity, learning from the echo of that failure, chose flexibility instead. Survival favored those who could let go without despair. As rest deepens, this lesson feels intuitive. The mind releases what it no longer needs. Awareness narrows gently. Nothing is forced to remain. Just as civilizations learn to survive by releasing excess, consciousness prepares for sleep by doing the same. The ancient rhythm repeats itself quietly, guiding both world and listener toward renewal without struggle. With flexibility now woven into daily life, humanity's sense of identity grew less rigid and more relational. People understood themselves not as isolated actors, but as participants within a larger movement of time. Individual lives were brief, yet meaningful, because they contributed to continuity. What one generation could not finish, another would carry forward. This awareness softened ambition and reduced despair. Nothing had to be completed alone. This outlook reshaped how memory was honored. Ancestors were remembered not for conquest, but for endurance. Stories celebrated those who preserved balance during difficult transitions, who knew when to act and when to wait. These figures were not idealized as perfect, but respected for their restraint. The Anunnaki, once distant rulers, now resembled these ancestral guides more than commanding gods. Language itself adapted to this worldview. Words for time, fate, and order became fluid, allowing multiple meanings to coexist. Certainty was replaced by resonance. Truth was not fixed, but approached gradually through repetition and reflection. This linguistic softness protected culture from the kind of rigidity that had once fractured the divine order. Even conflict, when it arose, was understood differently. Disagreement was not immediately feared as a threat to stability. It was seen as a signal that adjustment might be necessary. When voices were allowed to surface early, pressure could be released without rupture. This lesson echoed the earliest moment of the Anunnaki War, when refusal emerged from silence rather than violence. The gods' ancient failure to listen had reshaped humanity's approach to tension. People learned that suppression was more dangerous than expression, and that balance required circulation. Labor, authority, and knowledge all needed room to move. When any became fixed, instability followed. This insight became instinctive, passed down without explanation. As the night deepens, this circulation feels natural. Breath flows in and out, thoughts arise and dissolve. Nothing remains fixed for long. The same principle that guided civilizations now guides the mind toward rest. The Anunnaki, having withdrawn into silence, left behind not control, but rhythm. And rhythm, once learned, continues to carry life forward with quiet assurance. As this sense of rhythm became second nature, humanity's relationship with uncertainty softened further. The unknown was no longer something to be conquered or explained away, but something to be lived alongside. Mystery lost its threat and gained depth. The ancient world understood that not everything needed clarity to remain meaningful. Some truths were safer when approached slowly, from many angles across generations. This acceptance changed how people related to beginnings and endings. Birth was welcomed without expectation of permanence. Death was mourned without imagining finality. Both were seen as movements within a larger continuity that extended beyond individual experience. The Anunnaki, once associated with origin and decree, were now felt more strongly in transition than in arrival. Their presence lingered in thresholds, in moments where one state gave way to another. Ritual reflected this awareness. Ceremonies marked passage rather than control. They did not attempt to stop time, but to acknowledge its turning. These practices helped communities move together through change, reducing fear by giving shape to uncertainty. The ancient conflict among the gods, long dissolved into abstraction, lived on here as respect for transition. What had once been rupture became flow. Even knowledge followed this pattern. Learning was cumulative but cyclical. Old ideas returned in new forms. What was forgotten resurfaced later, altered but recognizable. This movement prevented stagnation without demanding constant novelty. Humanity learned to trust return as much as progress. The Anunnaki War, once a crisis of hierarchy and labor, had taught the world that continuity does not require sameness. Within this framework, silence gained importance. Pauses were not empty. They were necessary spaces where adjustment occurred unseen. Just as the gods had withdrawn to allow balance to re-emerge, people learned to step back at crucial moments. Action was balanced by waiting, speech by listening. This restraint became a source of strength. As rest approaches, this quiet restraint mirrors the body's own wisdom. Muscles soften, attention loosens, awareness drifts without direction. Nothing needs to be resolved. The ancient rhythm holds everything in place. The Anunnaki, having once struggled against imbalance, left behind a gentler inheritance. A world guided not by command, but by timing. And in that timing, both history and the mind find their way toward calm. With time, this trust in rhythm reshaped how humanity understood responsibility itself. Obligation was no longer framed as obedience to distant authority, but as attentiveness to consequence. Actions were weighed not by intention alone, but by how they echoed outward through community, land, and future generations. The world was understood as responsive. What was done returned, not immediately, but inevitably. This belief replaced fear with care. The Anunnaki conflict lingered here as a warning carried beneath awareness. The gods had once acted without fully sensing the long reach of their decisions. Labor was assigned, order was enforced. Only later did the weight of those choices surface as division. Humanity, inheriting this lesson indirectly, learned to move more slowly. Decisions were tested against memory, even when that memory no longer had a clear source. This shift encouraged cooperation over dominance. Survival favored groups that listened internally, that allowed tension to surface before it hardened. Councils replaced unilateral decree. Debate, though imperfect, prevented fracture. These social adaptations were not idealistic. They were practical responses shaped by an ancient understanding. Suppressed strain always returns with greater force. Even belief systems reflected this caution. Certainty was softened. Contradiction was tolerated. Different interpretations were allowed to exist side by side, reducing the risk of collapse through rigidity. The Anunnaki, once divided by fixed roles, now existed only as diffuse influence. Their experience had taught the world that unity imposed from above was fragile, while balance negotiated from within endured longer. As this wisdom matured, humanity grew less obsessed with origin and more attentive to continuation. Where did we come from mattered less than how we move forward without repeating what once broke the world. This focus allowed memory to fade without loss. What was essential remained active, even when its story dissolved. As the night deepens, this orientation toward consequence rather than certainty feels natural. The mind releases the need to define everything sharply. Thoughts pass without demand. Awareness settles into a quieter mode of listening. The same patience that carried civilizations through uncertainty now carries the listener toward rest. The ancient war no longer needs to be remembered. Its lesson has already been absorbed, and it moves gently, like breath, beneath the surface of time. As humanity learned to live with consequence rather than command, the idea of destiny itself began to soften. Fate was no longer imagined as a rigid script written by distant gods, but as a current shaped by countless small movements over time. Choice mattered, but only in relation to rhythm. One action rarely changed everything. Many actions, repeated without awareness, eventually did. This understanding reduced the pressure of decision and increased the importance of consistency. The Anunnaki conflict remained present in this shift, though only as shadow. The gods had once attempted to preserve order through structure alone, believing decree could outpace consequence. Humanity, observing the quieter outcome of that failure, learned to respect accumulation. Nothing broke the world all at once. Imbalance gathered slowly, invisibly, until correction became unavoidable. This awareness encouraged moderation not as virtue, but as survival. Daily life reflected this lesson in subtle ways. Calendars emphasized cycles rather than milestones. Work was organized around seasons, not ambition. Even celebration was tempered by return to routine. Excess joy, like excess power, was understood to carry weight. It was welcomed, but not prolonged beyond its moment. Balance was restored through return, not suppression. Spirituality deepened within this framework. The gods were no longer petitioned to alter outcomes, but acknowledged as witnesses to pattern. Prayer became less about request and more about attunement. To pray was to pause, to listen, to place oneself back within rhythm. The Anunnaki, once architects of order, were now remembered as participants who had learned restraint through experience. This reframing brought calm. When catastrophe appeared, it was met with recognition rather than disbelief. Something had grown out of scale. Correction had arrived. Grief was real, but panic was limited. Communities reorganized rather than dissolved. Continuity mattered more than explanation. As you rest within this long perspective, notice how gently it mirrors the movement toward sleep. Control fades, intention loosens, awareness returns to rhythm without effort. The ancient world trusted this process deeply. The gods withdrew so that time could teach. Humanity listened, and even now, that same quiet instruction continues, guiding both history and consciousness toward balance, one slow cycle at a time. As generations continued to pass, this trust in slow consequence reshaped humanity's relationship with catastrophe itself. Events that once would have been seen as the end of meaning were now understood as thresholds. A flood did not erase the world, it altered it. A collapse did not silence history, it redirected it. The ancient mind learned to look beyond the immediate loss toward what would inevitably follow. This outlook did not deny suffering, it contextualized it. The Anunnaki conflict lived quietly inside this perspective. The gods had once reached a breaking point because correction arrived too late. Humanity, inheriting that lesson without its narrative, grew attentive to early signals. Environmental shifts, social unrest, and cultural fatigue were no longer ignored. They were read as messages from time itself, warning that contraction was approaching. Preparation became more important than prevention. Survival then was no longer accidental. It was intentional. Seeds were stored. Skills were simplified. Knowledge was condensed into forms that could pass through disruption intact. Songs, gestures, and rituals proved more resilient than monuments or texts. When memory thinned, these carried continuity forward. The Anunnaki had once lost unity because structure outweighed flexibility. Humanity chose the opposite path. This choice reshaped identity. People did not define themselves solely by what they built, but by what they could carry, what could survive fire, water, or forgetting. Pride shifted from accumulation to endurance. A culture's strength was measured not by how high it rose, but by how gently it could fall and still continue. Religion adapted once more to reflect this maturity. The gods were no longer imagined as authors of disaster, but as keepers of threshold. They did not send collapse. They stood at its edge, ensuring that what emerged afterward could still find balance. The Anunnaki, once rulers, were now guardians of continuity rather than control. As the night deepens and the body grows heavier, this understanding feels calming. Nothing is final. Nothing is wasted. Even endings are shaped by rhythm. The ancient world lived with this awareness daily. The divine war that once threatened order had transformed into wisdom carried quietly through time. And that wisdom continues to hold the world gently, even as everything changes. As humanity continued to evolve within these cycles, the understanding of time itself became more refined. It was no longer viewed as a straight line from one event to the next, but as a vast, interwoven tapestry of beginnings and endings that continued to weave itself forward, regardless of human awareness. Each thread, whether vibrant or faded, played a role in the larger pattern. Nothing was lost, only reinterpreted, reshaped, or reincorporated into a more complex design. The rhythms of the past continued to play out, not as repetition, but as evolution. The Anunnaki, whose influence had once been direct, now lived primarily in these cycles. Their presence was felt in the ebb and flow of human experience, through the rise and fall of empires, the expansion and contraction of ideas, and the quiet moments when a society realigned itself with deeper truths. The gods had learned that their power did did not lie in domination, but in the shaping of pattern, and humanity, in turn, learned that its power lay not in control, but in adaptation to that pattern. This understanding of adaptation extended beyond just society and culture. It infiltrated personal lives as well. People learned to expect change and to move with it rather than against it. Careers shifted, relationships evolved, and identities reformed in response to forces outside personal control. What was once seen as failure was now accepted as part of the natural order of things. The Anunnaki's greatest lesson, the need to bend, to flow with time rather than resist it, had passed into the human consciousness. In this shift, the need for stability itself became more nuanced. Stability was not static. It was a dynamic state, constantly reformed in the process of being lived. Foundations were not built to be permanent. They were built to last, but only for as long as they could remain in balance. The minute imbalance surfaced, the structure would shift, adjust, and sometimes break, only to be reformed with greater understanding. The very essence of civilization was now a cycle of adaptation, rather than a singular pursuit of permanence. The myth of the Anunnaki no longer needed to be retold in grand battles. It had faded into a quieter wisdom. The gods were no longer figures of domination. They were aspects of the very process of living. The world, in its slow turning, had absorbed the conflict and moved forward, richer for it, but never forgetting what had once been learned. As the mind releases further into stillness, feel the subtle influence of these cycles moving in the background. The earth turns, the stars shift. Time itself moves not forward, but through, carrying lessons not as knowledge to be remembered, but as wisdom to be lived. The ancient war, long past, has found its final resting place in the steady movement of life itself. As this wisdom settled deeper into human awareness, the concept of inheritance began to change. What was passed down was no longer only bloodline, land, or authority, but orientation. Each generation inherited a way of sensing when balance was being approached and when it was being left behind. This sensitivity did not require instruction. It emerged naturally through repetition, through watching what endured and what dissolved. The Anunnaki conflict lived on here, not as memory, but as calibration. Cultures learned to embed this calibration into their environments. Cities were built in harmony with landscape rather than against it. Sacred spaces were aligned with celestial cycles, reinforcing the connection between earth and sky. Architecture itself became a form of listening, shaped by awareness that permanence was an illusion. Structures were designed to age, to weather, to eventually return to the land that held them. This acceptance of return was not resignation, it was respect. Language, too, adapted to carry this long awareness. Words describing time, fate, and order remained intentionally flexible. Meaning was allowed to shift as circumstances changed. Fixed definitions were avoided where possible because rigidity had once proven dangerous even among gods. The Anunnaki had fractured when roles hardened beyond adjustment. Humanity responded by leaving room for reinterpretation. This flexibility extended into moral understanding. Right and wrong were no longer seen as static absolutes, but as orientations toward balance. Actions were judged by their long effect rather than immediate appearance. This encouraged patience and reduced extremes. Judgment softened. Observation deepened. The world was no longer divided sharply between success and failure, but understood as a continuous process of correction. Within this framework, suffering gained context without losing its weight. Pain was not dismissed, but it was not allowed to define the whole. It marked moments of transition, places where the system resisted adjustment. These moments were difficult, but meaningful. The ancient war had taught creation that resistance to change carries cost, while acceptance carries continuity. As sleep draws nearer, this understanding mirrors the mind's own release. Thought loosens its grip. Definitions soften. Awareness drifts without demand for resolution. The same intelligence that once guided civilizations through collapse now guides consciousness toward rest. The Anunnaki are no longer needed as figures. Their lesson has become atmosphere, holding everything gently in motion as the night deepens. As humanity carried this inherited sensitivity forward, the idea of progress itself became quieter and more inward. Advancement was no longer measured only by expansion of territory or accumulation of power, but by the ability to remain in balance across long spans of time. A society that endured without exhausting its land or its people was considered successful, even if it left few monuments behind. This perspective marked a profound departure from earlier ages of assertion. The Anunnaki conflict had shown, through divine example, that dominance without listening eventually collapses. This quieter understanding reshaped how people related to the natural world. Rivers were no longer obstacles to be controlled, but partners to be observed. Seasons were teachers rather than challenges. When floods came, they were not viewed solely as destruction, but as reminders of scale. Humanity learned to rebuild with humility, adapting settlements rather than forcing permanence. The world itself became a participant in correction, not an enemy to be subdued. Within communities, this awareness encouraged shared responsibility. No single role was believed sufficient to maintain balance alone. Farmers, builders, elders, and storytellers all contributed different forms of attention. Each perspective mattered because imbalance rarely announced itself in one place only. The ancient gods had fractured when authority became isolated from labor. Humanity responded by valuing circulation. Knowledge moved, power shifted, stagnation was watched carefully. The Anunnaki, now fully absorbed into principle rather than personality, were remembered through this circulation. Their names lingered in ritual, but their presence was felt most strongly in the way societies adjusted without instruction. The gods had learned restraint through conflict. Humanity demonstrated that learning by applying restraint as habit. Correction no longer required catastrophe every time. Sometimes, listening was enough. Even when collapse could not be avoided, it unfolded differently. Communities broke apart more gently. Traditions fragmented rather than vanished. What survived did so in pieces, carried into new contexts where it could be reassembled differently. The ancient war had taught that wholeness was not required for continuity. Fragments, when held with care, were sufficient. As the mind settles deeper into rest, this fragmented continuity feels reassuring. You do not need to hold everything together to remain whole. Balance returns through release as much as effort. The world learned this slowly, across countless cycles of loss and renewal. The Anunnaki stepped back so that this quieter wisdom could emerge. And in the stillness of night, that same wisdom continues its work, gently guiding both history and awareness toward equilibrium without force. As humanity lived within this new understanding, the very nature of what it meant to live transformed. Life was no longer a race toward accumulation or dominance, but a journey within a larger rhythm. The world became a space of constant negotiation, not between competing forces, but between adaptation and excess. Where once civilizations reached outward to conquer, now they reached inward to align. The Anunnaki conflict had taught humanity that peace was not a given, but something that required active listening and gentle realignment. This shift extended to human identity. People no longer saw themselves as separate from the world around them, but as part of a larger, interconnected flow. Identity became defined less by position and more by relationship, to the land, to each other, and to the unseen forces that govern cycles. This worldview softened ambition but deepened purpose. People no longer sought to control the world. They sought to understand it, to align with it. The gods, in their silence, had allowed humanity to step into this quieter, more collaborative role. The lessons learned from the Anunnaki conflict continued to manifest in human societies through their approach to leadership. Leaders no longer saw themselves as rulers, but as stewards. They were entrusted with the care of balance, not the imposition of order. A king's strength lay not in the number of people he controlled, but in how well he listened to the needs of his land and people. This form of governance was not perfect, but it was steady. It allowed for change without collapse, growth without greed. In this quieter world, culture itself became a tool for continuity rather than expansion. Art, music, and storytelling were not just expressions of individual creativity, but ways to preserve rhythm, to remind each generation of the cycles that shaped them. Myths continued to be told, not as grand tales of divine conquest, but as small stories of human resilience, patience, and adaptation. The gods, no longer needing to intervene directly, were now remembered as teachers who had shown the way not through force, but through the wisdom of restraint. Even in times of hardship, humanity had learned to accept that imbalance would come. The gods had shown that collapse was not a failure, but a necessary part of the larger process. What mattered most was the response. Communities did not fall apart in despair. Instead, they reorganized. They returned to simplicity. They listened again to the earth, the sky, and to each other, adjusting, repairing, and growing, not in spite of their challenges, but because of them. As you settle further into rest, this sense of interconnectedness quietly grows. Each breath, each thought, is part of a larger rhythm that needs no force to continue. Just as civilizations rose and fell in cycles, your own awareness cycles between wakefulness and sleep. This rhythm, ancient and unhurried, continues, moving gently through time, carrying wisdom that was learned long ago. And in that gentle movement, everything finds its place, whether remembered or not. As this way of living matured, humanity's sense of belonging expanded beyond the boundaries of any single era. People no longer felt anchored only to their present moment, but connected to a long procession of lives that had faced similar tensions, losses, and renewals. This continuity offered comfort. Whatever uncertainty appeared had already been encountered in another form. Whatever balance was lost had been found again before. The Anunnaki conflict lingered here as reassurance rather than warning. Even fracture could be survived. This awareness reshaped how endings were approached. The closing of a reign, the abandonment of a city, the fading of a tradition were no longer treated as failures to be hidden. They were acknowledged openly, marked with ceremony, and allowed to pass with dignity. To end well became as important as to begin well. The gods had once struggled to accept the limits of their own order. Humanity learned, slowly, to release what could no longer be sustained. Knowledge followed the same principle. Instead of striving to preserve everything, cultures focused on what could travel lightly through time. Skills that relied on cooperation endured longer than those that depended on dominance. Techniques that adapted to local conditions survived where rigid systems failed. This selectivity was not loss, but refinement. The Anunnaki War had demonstrated that complexity without flexibility invites collapse. Humanity responded by choosing resilience over scale. Even memory itself became more fluid. Stories changed as they were retold, not out of error, but out of necessity. Each generation shaped the past to speak to its present, ensuring relevance over accuracy. The gods were no longer fixed figures, but shifting symbols that reflected the needs of the moment. The Anunnaki, once bound to specific roles, now existed as echoes that could take many forms without losing meaning. This fluid memory fostered compassion. When people recognized that their own struggles mirrored those of the past, judgment softened. Conflict was no longer seen solely as moral failure, but as misalignment in need of correction. This did not eliminate suffering, but it reduced cruelty. Understanding replaced blame. The ancient conflict among the gods had taught that punishment alone deepens fracture. As the night deepens, this compassion feels natural. Thoughts lose their sharp edges. Concerns relax their grip. Awareness widens, then gently settles. The same patience that allowed civilizations to endure change now guides the mind toward rest. The Anunnaki have long since dissolved into silence, but the wisdom shaped by their conflict continues to move quietly through time, steady and forgiving, carrying all things forward without urgency. As compassion took deeper root, humanity's understanding of conflict itself began to soften. Struggle was no longer viewed as an intrusion into order, but as part of how order renewed itself. Disagreement, tension, and even collapse were accepted as movements within a larger process, rather than signs that something had gone irreparably wrong. This perspective reduced fear and replaced it with attentiveness. One did not ask how to eliminate conflict, but how to move through it without losing balance. The Anunnaki conflict lingered most clearly in this shift of attitude. The gods had once treated division as a threat to be suppressed, only to discover that suppression intensified fracture. Humanity, inheriting this lesson indirectly, learned to allow tension to surface earlier. Councils gathered, stories circulated, rituals adapted. By giving space to strain, societies prevented it from hardening into catastrophe as often. Balance was not forced, it was negotiated. This negotiation reshaped how communities understood unity. Unity no longer meant sameness. It meant coherence amid difference. Roles remained distinct, but no longer immovable. Labor, authority, and knowledge were allowed to circulate, reducing the pressure that had once divided even the divine order. Flexibility became the quiet foundation of stability. Spiritual belief reflected this evolution. The gods were not imagined as beings who demanded harmony at all costs, but as witnesses to the ongoing effort of maintaining it. Prayer became less about asking for resolution and more about seeking steadiness. The Anunnaki, once figures of command, now symbolized endurance through adjustment. Their silence was interpreted not as distance, but as trust. Over long stretches of time, this trust transformed how humanity related to the future. The unknown was not feared as an abyss, but approached as a continuation of familiar cycles. Whatever came would require attention, restraint, and patience. These qualities had already proven sufficient to carry life forward through countless changes. As the body grows heavier and awareness drifts, this sense of negotiated balance feels comforting. Thoughts arise without urgency and pass without resistance. Nothing demands immediate resolution. The ancient world lived within this calm uncertainty for millennia. The Anunnaki stepped back so that humanity could learn it slowly. And even now, that same lesson continues to guide the mind toward rest, carried gently on the rhythm of time itself. As this negotiated balance became woven into everyday life, humanity's sense of scale grew more refined. People understood that not every imbalance required dramatic response. Some tensions resolved themselves if given time and space. Others required gentle adjustment rather than force. This discernment marked a quiet maturity. The world no longer reacted impulsively. It responded gradually, guided by accumulated experience rather than urgency. The memory of the Anunnaki conflict lived here as restraint. The gods had once acted from a place of absolute authority, believing correction must be immediate and decisive. Humanity learned a different approach. Delay became a tool. Observation became an act of care. By waiting, by watching patterns unfold, people avoided repeating the divine mistake of acting too soon, too strongly, without listening to what imbalance was revealing. This patience reshaped how suffering was met. Pain was not ignored, but it was not allowed to dictate action blindly. Communities gathered around loss, offering continuity rather than answers. The goal was not to erase discomfort, but to ensure it did not fracture the whole. This approach reduced panic and preserved cohesion. Even hardship became a moment of collective attention rather than isolation. The gods, now fully absorbed into principle, were sensed most strongly in this collective awareness. The Anunnaki no longer appeared as rulers issuing decree, but as reminders of proportion. Their ancient struggle had shown that power without reflection leads to rupture. Humanity honored that lesson by choosing response over reaction, adjustment over domination. As night deepens and the mind relaxes, this measured pace feels natural. Breathing slows, thoughts lengthen and then dissolve. Nothing insists on resolution. The ancient world trusted this rhythm because it had learned, slowly and repeatedly, that balance returns on its own when space is allowed. The Anunnaki War, once a crisis of authority, has become a quiet teacher of timing. And timing, once learned, guides both history and rest without effort, carrying awareness gently toward stillness. With this trust in timing firmly established, humanity began to sense that meaning itself was something that unfolded rather than something that could be seized. Insight arrived slowly, often long after the events that shaped it. What mattered was not immediate understanding, but the willingness to remain present within uncertainty. The ancient world did not rush to define its experience. It allowed interpretation to mature alongside memory. The Anunnaki conflict lingered within this patience as a reminder of what happens when certainty outruns listening. The gods had once believed their knowledge sufficient to govern creation without pause. Humanity learned the opposite. Knowing too quickly carried risk. Acting too decisively could harden imbalance instead of resolving it. Wisdom, therefore, was approached as something earned through duration, not declared through authority. This approach softened the boundaries between past and present. History was not distant. It was active, influencing choices through pattern rather than instruction. People felt the weight of what had come before without needing to name it. The world carried its own memory in the shape of landscapes, customs, and recurring challenges. The Anunnaki no longer needed to be recalled as figures. Their experience had become embedded in how time behaved. Even aspiration changed under this influence. The desire to leave a permanent mark gave way to the desire to leave the world stable enough for continuation. Legacy was measured in continuity rather than monument. This quiet ambition reduced excess and encouraged care. The gods had once reached for permanence and found fracture. Humanity chose endurance instead. As awareness settles deeper into rest, this unfolding sense of meaning feels familiar. Thoughts no longer demand immediate clarity. They drift, connect, and release. The same patience that guided civilizations through uncertainty now guides consciousness toward sleep. The ancient conflict has long since dissolved into rhythm, and within that rhythm, both history and the present moment find their place, unforced and at ease. As humanity continued to mature within this slow unfolding of meaning, the need to define reality in absolute terms gradually weakened. Certainty, once prized as safety, came to be understood as limitation. The ancient world learned that rigid answers aged poorly, while open questions endured. What remained flexible could survive change. What hardened too tightly eventually cracked. This understanding did not undermine faith. It refined it. The Anunnaki conflict echoed quietly within this refinement. The gods had once believed their structure complete, their hierarchy sufficient. Only when strain accumulated did they recognize how brittle that certainty had become. Humanity, inheriting the echo of that failure, learned to treat belief as orientation rather than conclusion, one aligned with balance instead of declaring possession of truth. This orientation reshaped how stories were told. Narratives grew layered, symbolic, and deliberately unfinished. Myths ended without resolution. Origins blurred into cycles. These stories were not meant to instruct directly, but to slow the listener, to invite reflection rather than obedience. The Anunnaki appeared within them less as characters and more as forces that receded the closer one tried to grasp them. Over time, this storytelling approach trained attention itself. People listened for resonance rather than detail. Meaning was sensed emotionally, intuitively, through repetition. A story did not need to be remembered word for word to remain effective. Its rhythm alone was enough to guide behavior. This was memory at its most resilient, the kind that survives forgetting. Social structures mirrored this narrative softness. Laws allowed interpretation. Customs adapted to circumstance. Even authority learned to speak indirectly through example and expectation rather than decree. This reduced conflict without eliminating difference. The world did not become harmonious, but it became navigable. Tension flowed rather than pooled. The Anunnaki, once figures of command, now existed primarily as absence. Their silence shaped more than their presence ever had. It allowed humanity to develop judgment without instruction, balance without enforcement. The gods had withdrawn not to abandon creation, but to prevent repeating their own mistake. As the night deepens and awareness loosens, this absence feels gentle. Nothing presses for certainty. Nothing demands conclusion. The mind drifts comfortably within open space, just as ancient civilizations drifted within time, guided by pattern rather than command. The war that once threatened order has long since dissolved into patience, and patience, once learned, continues to hold the world quietly together, even as everything moves. As patience replaced certainty, humanity's relationship with explanation itself began to change. People no longer felt compelled to resolve every mystery or to press meaning into final form. Some questions were allowed to remain open, carried forward like embers rather than extinguished through definition. This openness did not weaken understanding. It deepened it. The world became something to move with, not something to master. The Anunnaki conflict continued to echo here as a quiet, cautionary presence. The gods had once attempted to close the system, to finalize order and distribute roles permanently. That closure had generated pressure, resistance, and fracture. Humanity learned instead to keep its systems slightly unfinished. Space was left for adjustment. Silence was left between words. These gaps allowed balance to breathe. Even sacred knowledge reflected this shift. Teachings were layered, sometimes contradictory, inviting reflection rather than obedience. Wisdom was not presented as instruction alone, but as invitation. One returned to the same idea repeatedly, finding different meanings as circumstances changed. In this way, knowledge remained alive. The Anunnaki, once holders of fixed authority, now existed as symbols of a lesson learned through failure and restraint. This approach softened the edges of identity. Individuals were not expected to remain the same across a lifetime. Change was anticipated, even welcomed. Just as societies reformed after collapse, people reformed after loss, age, or insight. Continuity did not require sameness. It required movement that stayed within rhythm. The world itself seemed to cooperate with this understanding. Landscapes shifted slowly. Rivers changed course over generations. Forests returned where cities had fallen. These changes were not viewed as erasure, but as participation in the same cycle humanity was learning to honor. The gods were present in this cooperation, not as controllers, but as witnesses. As rest draws nearer, this acceptance of unfinished meaning feels natural. Thoughts lose urgency. Questions no longer demand answers before sleep can arrive. Awareness settles into a gentle openness, trusting that clarity, when needed, will return on its own. The ancient war among the Anunnaki has long since dissolved into this trust. And within that trust, both history and the present moment are carried forward, unforced, toward quiet renewal. As this openness became woven into the fabric of life, humanity's sense of control softened even further. Control was no longer mistaken for stability. In fact, the ancient world came to recognize that excessive control often signaled fear rather than strength. True steadiness emerged when systems were allowed to adjust themselves, guided by attention rather than force. This realization marked another quiet turning point in the long aftermath of the Anunnaki conflict. The gods' ancient fracture lingered here as a negative image, a shape defined by what was no longer pursued. The Anunnaki had once attempted to govern reality through fixed roles and enforced order, believing that structure alone could prevent chaos. Humanity learned instead that rigidity invited pressure, and pressure eventually demanded release. By leaving space for variation, societies reduced the intensity of collapse when it came. Breaks became bends. Endings became transitions. This philosophy altered humanity's relationship with authority at every level. Leaders were no longer expected to embody certainty, but responsiveness. A ruler who listened was valued more than one who commanded flawlessly. Wisdom was measured by timing rather than decisiveness. Acting too quickly became as dangerous as acting too late. This sensitivity to timing echoed the divine lesson learned through failure. The Anunnaki had acted from certainty. Humanity learned to act from awareness. Cultural expression reflected this shift as well. Art grew less monumental and more symbolic. Meaning was suggested rather than declared. Music emphasized repetition and variation instead of climax. These forms trained perception itself, encouraging patience and depth rather than excitement. They prepared the mind to live within cycles without demanding resolution. The ancient war no longer needed to be remembered as event. Its lesson had become aesthetic. Even the idea of truth adapted to this rhythm. Truth was no longer singular or final. It was relational, changing depending on context, time, and perspective. This did not create confusion. It reduced conflict. When no single version of reality needed to dominate, coexistence became possible. The gods had once divided because authority could not bend. Humanity chose flexibility as survival. As sleep approaches, this flexibility feels intuitive. The mind stops trying to hold itself together tightly. Thoughts drift, overlap, and fade. Awareness loosens its grip without anxiety. The same gentle intelligence that allowed civilizations to endure change now guides consciousness toward rest. The Anunnaki, having stepped back long ago, left behind a world capable of adjusting itself quietly. And within that quiet adjustment, both history and the present moment continue, balanced not by force, but by time itself. As humanity settled into this quieter relationship with time and control, a new sense of responsibility emerged, one that was neither imposed nor dramatic. Responsibility became less about obligation and more about awareness. People learned that every action, no matter how small, contributed to the overall tone of balance or imbalance. Nothing stood alone. Choices echoed forward, sometimes softly, sometimes across generations. The Anunnaki conflict survived most clearly within this awareness. The gods had once underestimated how small, unexamined decisions could accumulate into fracture. Humanity, carrying the distant echo of that failure, grew attentive to gradual shifts. A change in custom, a subtle hardening of hierarchy, a loss of listening. These were no longer ignored. They were treated as early signals, invitations to adjust before collapse became necessary. This attentiveness reshaped the idea of responsibility across time. People did not imagine themselves accountable only to ancestors or descendants, but to the present moment itself. Balance was something practiced daily, not promised abstractly. Care for land, for labor, for speech, and for silence became ethical acts. The gods were no longer needed as judges. Consequence itself provided feedback. The world responded to this approach with resilience. When disruption arrived, recovery followed more gently. Collapse still occurred, but it unfolded with less violence, leaving more continuity intact. Knowledge thinned but did not vanish. Communities contracted but did not dissolve completely. The ancient conflict had taught that survival depended on what could move, not what could dominate. This understanding also softened humanity's fear of insignificance. Individual lives were brief but meaningful because they participated in a longer rhythm. One did not need to complete the story. One only needed to contribute without excess. The Anunnaki, once burdened by the need to control creation, had stepped back so that this lighter form of meaning could emerge. As the night deepens and thought slows further, this sense of proportion becomes calming. You are not required to hold everything together. Balance does not rest on effort alone. It returns naturally when pressure eases. The ancient world trusted this deeply, and that trust continues to move quietly through time, guiding both history and the present moment toward rest without urgency or demand. As this lighter sense of meaning settled into human awareness, The urgency to define an ultimate purpose began to fade. Life no longer needed a final explanation to feel complete. Purpose was found in participation rather than destination. To live attentively, to respond rather than dominate, to adjust rather than insist, became sufficient. This shift did not diminish significance. It redistributed it across moments instead of concentrating it in conclusions. The Anunnaki conflict echoed quietly within this redistribution. The gods had once carried too much weight within a single structure, believing that order must be centralized and permanent. Humanity learned instead to let meaning circulate. No single era, institution, or belief system was expected to contain everything. When something grew too heavy with expectation, it fractured. By allowing meaning to move, societies reduced strain. This circulation shaped how cultures related to sacredness. The sacred was no longer confined to temples or ceremonies alone. It appeared in ordinary acts done with care, planting, listening, waiting. These gestures carried the same stabilizing force as ritual once had. The gods did not need to be invoked loudly. Their lesson had become behavior. Over time, this softened even humanity's relationship with failure. Mistakes were no longer seen as proof of unworthiness, but as information. When something did not endure, it revealed where balance had been lost. This information was valued rather than denied. The ancient war among the gods had shown that denial deepens fracture. Humanity chose recognition instead. The world itself seemed to respond to this humility. Recovery followed collapse more gently. Landscapes regenerated. Cultures blended and reformed. What returned was never identical, but it carried enough continuity to remain recognizable. The Anunnaki, once associated with creation and decree, were now felt most strongly in this capacity for return. As rest approaches, this gentler view of meaning feels natural. There is no need to resolve everything before sleep. Awareness can loosen without fear. The same intelligence that guides civilizations through renewal now guides the mind toward stillness. The ancient conflict has long since dissolved into this quiet acceptance, and within it, both world and listener are carried forward, calm and unburdened, into the rhythm of the night. As humanity continued to move within this quiet acceptance, the sense of belonging deepened even further. People no longer felt separate from the long movement of time, but held within it. The past was not something finished behind them, nor the future something distant ahead. Both existed as pressures and invitations, shaping the present moment. To live well was not to escape this movement, but to stay in step with it. The Anunnaki conflict remained present here as a distant but steady undertone. The gods had once stood apart from consequence, believing themselves above the rhythms they governed. Their fracture revealed that no position, however elevated, exists outside balance. Humanity absorbed this truth slowly. Power was no longer imagined as exemption, but as responsibility to remain responsive. Those who forgot this inevitably lost their footing. This understanding reshaped how societies approached continuity. Preservation no longer meant freezing forms in place. It meant allowing them to change without losing coherence. Traditions evolved. Laws adapted. Even sacred stories shifted tone and emphasis as circumstances changed. What endured was not exact content, but orientation. The ability to recognize when something had drifted too far from balance mattered more than loyalty to any fixed shape. Within this flexibility, the idea of progress became quieter and more humane. Advancement was measured by reduction of strain rather than expansion of reach. A society that required less correction was considered wiser than one that demanded constant repair. This perspective reduced competition and increased cooperation. Survival favored those who could share attention rather than assert dominance. The world itself mirrored this approach. Ecosystems adjusted gradually when left room to do so. Where pressure eased, renewal followed. The Anunnaki, once imagined as rulers of nature, were now understood as participants who had learned the cost of forcing order. Their withdrawal allowed the world to demonstrate its own capacity for self-correction. As the body relaxes further and awareness drifts, this sense of being held within a larger rhythm becomes comforting. Nothing must be rushed. Nothing must be completed tonight. The ancient world learned to trust this containment after long experience with imbalance and repair. That trust continues to move quietly through time, guiding both history and the present moment toward rest, steady and unforced. As this trust in being held by rhythm settled fully into human consciousness, even the fear of disappearance began to soften. To fade was no longer the same as to be erased. What dissolved left impressions. What ended altered what followed. Humanity learned that absence itself could carry influence, just as the Anunnaki had shaped the world most profoundly after they withdrew. Silence became meaningful. What was no longer visible still participated. The ancient conflict among the gods lived quietly within this realization. The Anunnaki had once believed their presence was essential to order. Their war revealed the opposite. Too much presence distorted balance. Too much authority compressed the system until it fractured. Humanity absorbed this lesson slowly, discovering that restraint often preserved more than intervention. What stepped back allowed space for continuity to emerge on its own. This understanding reshaped humanity's relationship with legacy. To leave something behind did not require permanence. A gesture, a method, a way of listening could endure longer than stone. Influence no longer depended on recognition. It moved anonymously through time, carried by behavior rather than name. The gods, once defined by titles and domains, had themselves become examples of this anonymous endurance. Even the idea of loss changed under this lens. Loss was no longer purely subtractive. It created room. When something vanished, something else had space to form. This did not erase grief, but it gave grief context. Sorrow marked transition rather than termination. The Anunnaki conflict, once a wound in divine history, had transformed into a lesson about release. Human societies learned to incorporate this release into ritual and story. Endings were acknowledged deliberately, allowing communities to let go together rather than fragment alone. This collective release reduced fear and preserved cohesion. What followed felt less like collapse and more like turning. As sleep draws nearer, this acceptance of fading feels gentle and familiar. Thoughts thin. Awareness loosens. Nothing resists disappearance. The same intelligence that carried civilizations through endings now carries the mind toward rest. The gods withdrew so that this wisdom could be learned without force. And in the quiet of night, that wisdom continues its work, guiding consciousness softly into stillness. As the long movement of time carried humanity forward, the sense of inheritance became almost imperceptible, yet deeply rooted. People no longer spoke often of what had been passed down. They lived it. The rhythms shaped behavior without instruction, guiding choices quietly, like an inner current. The Anunnaki conflict, once a defining rupture, now existed only as a faint pressure that kept excess in check. This inheritance expressed itself most clearly during moments of stillness. In pauses between action, in the spaces where nothing demanded immediate response, awareness sharpened. People learned that clarity often arrived only after motion ceased. The gods themselves had reached understanding only after withdrawing. Humanity mirrored this lesson, discovering that stepping back revealed more than constant effort ever could. Over generations, this insight reshaped the relationship between memory and forgetting. Forgetting was no longer feared as loss. It was understood as part of renewal. What mattered found its way back. What did not was allowed to fade without regret. This selective memory protected balance. The Anunnaki had once carried too much responsibility within a single structure. Humanity learned to let memory breathe. This breathing space softened the edges of belief. Faith no longer demanded certainty. It rested comfortably alongside doubt. Questions were allowed to linger, unresolved, without destabilizing the whole. The ancient war among the gods had shown that rigid conviction leads to fracture. Flexibility preserved continuity. As rest deepens, this openness feels natural. Thoughts drift in and out without attachment. Nothing insists on permanence. The same quiet intelligence that shaped civilizations now shapes the descent into sleep. The Anunnaki, long silent, remain present only as this gentle restraint, guiding awareness toward calm by reminding it that nothing needs to be held too tightly to endure. As the narrative enters its final descent, time itself begins to feel less like a sequence and more like a presence. The distinction between past, present, and future grows thin, almost transparent. Humanity no longer stands at a point within history, looking backward or forward. It rests inside a continuous movement that has always been unfolding. What once appeared as ancient conflict now feels like a distant pressure that gently shapes behavior without demanding attention. The Anunnaki, whose division once strained the structure of existence, are no longer remembered as actors within this movement. Their conflict has dissolved into consequence. It survives not as story, but as sensitivity, a quiet awareness that excess creates weight, that rigidity invites fracture, that authority, when isolated from listening, eventually collapses inward. These understandings no longer need to be taught. They are felt. At this stage, humanity's relationship with balance becomes almost instinctive. Long before collapse is visible, discomfort appears. A subtle fatigue, a loss of resonance, a sense that repetition has hardened into obligation. These sensations act as early signals, far gentler than catastrophe, far kinder than collapse. The gods once ignored such signals until refusal became inevitable. Humanity learned to notice sooner. Because of this attentiveness, correction rarely arrives with violence anymore. Instead, it arrives as slowing, as disinterest, as the quiet fading of systems that no longer serve the rhythm they were meant to support. What once would have ended in fire now ends in silence. Structures dissolve rather than shatter. This is not weakness, it is refinement. The Anunnaki are present here only as restraint, not as rulers, not as judges, but as the reason why permanence feels unnatural. Their ancient struggle taught creation that holding too tightly distorts flow. Humanity internalized this lesson across generations, learning to loosen its grip before damage occurs. Stability is no longer confused with stasis. Endurance no longer demands immobility. Civilizations shaped by this understanding begin to measure themselves differently. They no longer compare their achievements against eternity. Instead, they ask quieter questions. Did life continue with less strain? Did knowledge pass without domination? Did meaning survive without becoming rigid? These questions do not produce monuments. They produce continuity. In such societies, ambition softens, not because desire disappears, but because scale is respected. Growth is allowed, but watched. Complexity is explored, but not worshipped. When something grows too heavy, it is simplified without shame. When something ends, it is allowed to end without panic. The world no longer fears incompleteness. This perspective transforms even loss. Loss is no longer experienced as pure absence. It is recognized as space, space for reconfiguration, space for return in altered form. What vanishes does not leave emptiness behind. It leaves room. The Anunnaki conflict, once a rupture born of inflexibility, becomes here a lesson about release. As night deepens, this sense of release becomes personal. The mind begins to mirror the same behavior learned by civilizations. It stops insisting. It stops carrying what no longer needs to be carried. Thoughts arise more slowly. Connections loosen. Attention drifts without resistance. Nothing essential is lost in this drifting. What matters does not require effort to remain. It returns when needed, just as balance always returns when pressure eases. The same rhythm that carried humanity through ages of correction now carries consciousness toward rest. At this point, The ancient war no longer feels like something that happened in the distant past. It feels like something that resolved into wisdom so complete it no longer needs to speak. Wisdom that does not instruct. Wisdom that simply holds. And in being held, the world grows quiet enough to rest. As the quiet deepens, responsibility itself completes its long transformation. What once felt like obligation, burden, or duty now settles into something lighter and more spacious. Humanity no longer experiences responsibility as something imposed from above or inherited as weight from the past. It is felt instead as attentiveness, a willingness to notice when balance is present and when it begins to drift. Nothing more is required. This attentiveness is the true resolution of the Anunnaki conflict. The gods had once carried responsibility as authority. They believed order depended on command, on decree, on control maintained without interruption. When strain accumulated, their response was to reinforce structure rather than soften it. Humanity, living within the echo of that failure, learned another way. Attention replaced domination. Listening replaced enforcement. In this state, effort changes its nature. Action still occurs, but it no longer feels compulsive. It arises naturally when conditions call for it and dissolves when those conditions pass. There is no anxiety about inactivity. Waiting is recognized as movement of a different kind. Silence becomes functional rather than threatening. The gods once mistook silence for loss of power. Humanity learned that silence allows systems to recalibrate themselves without force. The future, viewed from this perspective, no longer provokes urgency. It does not demand prediction or mastery. It is approached with calm curiosity, shaped by the understanding that whatever arrives will do so within familiar patterns. Nothing entirely new emerges without precedent. Nothing entirely final arrives without continuation. This expectation softens fear without eliminating care. The Anunnaki, now almost entirely absorbed into principle, are no longer imagined as watchers or judges. If they are present at all, they exist as witnesses to rhythm. They do not intervene because intervention is unnecessary. The world has learned how to correct itself gently, long before fracture demands violence. This self-correction is their true legacy. Within human societies shaped by this understanding, power diffuses naturally. No single institution is expected to carry all meaning. No single belief is tasked with explaining everything. Meaning circulates, preventing overload. This circulation reduces brittleness. Systems bend instead of breaking. When something fails, it does not take the whole with it. This diffusion also softens identity. Individuals no longer feel pressured to be complete or permanent. A life is understood as a contribution rather than a conclusion. One does not need to resolve the story. One only needs to participate without excess. The gods once bore too much responsibility alone. Humanity learned to share it. As sleep draws closer, this shared responsibility feels embodied. Muscles release before pain insists. Breath deepens before strain accumulates. Awareness narrows without instruction. Rest arrives not because it is commanded, but because resistance fades. The same intelligence that governs balance in civilizations governs the body at night. The hidden war has now fully transformed into this capacity for release. What once threatened existence has become its quiet stabilizer. Conflict did not vanish. It softened into signal. Authority did not disappear. It diffused into awareness. Control did not prevail. It gave way to rhythm. And within this rhythm, both history and consciousness prepare to rest. Nothing is demanded. Nothing is unfinished. The movement continues without urgency, carrying everything gently forward into stillness. Now the movement no longer asks to be followed. It settles into stillness, not as an ending, but as a resting state within continuation. There is no final answer waiting beyond this moment. No hidden revelation meant to resolve everything that came before. The ancient world understood that resolution is rare and often unnecessary. What matters is integration. The Anunnaki conflict, once a fracture within divine order, has completed its long transformation into something indistinguishable from the rhythm of existence itself. Humanity now lives inside that rhythm without effort. The struggle between authority and adaptation, between command and listening, has softened into instinct. Balance is no longer enforced, it is felt. When pressure builds, awareness responds. When excess appears, restraint follows naturally. No voice announces this process. It unfolds quietly, the way breath adjusts during sleep without instruction. The gods once believed they were separate from the system they governed. Their conflict revealed that no being, however powerful, exists outside consequence. Humanity absorbed this truth slowly, across generations of rise and collapse. What remains is not guilt or fear, but humility, a calm understanding that participation matters more than control, and that restraint preserves more than force ever could. Collapse, when it arrives, no longer feels like punishment. Renewal, when it follows, no longer feels miraculous. Both are ordinary movements within a system that learned, through long experience, how to correct itself. The Anunnaki once resisted this ordinariness, believing order required constant assertion. Humanity learned the opposite. Continuity requires space. This space is what now surrounds awareness. Words loosen, images fade, meaning no longer presses to be understood. It rests comfortably without definition, like gravity holding everything in place without announcing itself. The story has done what it needed to do. It has slowed perception enough for listening to occur. You are no longer hearing about ancient gods or forgotten wars. You are resting inside the same continuity that shaped them. The same patience that carried civilizations through ages of correction now carries thought toward silence. Nothing needs to be remembered clearly. Nothing needs to be resolved. The Anunnaki stepped back so this quiet intelligence could move freely. Their absence was not loss. It was completion. What they learned through conflict no longer needs voice or symbol. It lives as rhythm. As rest fully arrives, even the sense of story dissolves. There is only calm awareness, floating gently within time. The hidden war has faded completely, not erased, not denied, but absorbed so fully that it no longer feels separate from peace. And so everything settles. The world continues, breath continues, time continues, quietly.